Hello, I'm JC Punongbayan, Rappler's resident economist and assistant professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. Welcome to Rappler Talk. The COVID-19 pandemic wrought a lot of damage on educational systems all over the world. It caused tremendous learning losses or a loss or reversal of skills and knowledge that students ought to be mastering in school. In the Philippines, which experienced one of the world's longest lockdowns and school closures, the learning losses are estimated to be especially large. How can we abate these learning losses? Recent research tells us that while this is difficult, solving the problem is not at all impossible. Joining us today is Noam Angrist, co-founder of Youth Impact Org, an NGO dedicated to scaling up health and education programs backed by rigorous randomized trial evidence. Noam is also the academic director of the What Works Hub for Global Education at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. He's here today to talk about their new study, Building Resilient Education Systems, Evidence from Large-Scale Randomized Trials in 5 countries. Welcome, Noam, to Rappler Talk, and very good to have you here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you, JC.
So maybe, Noam, we can start with a brief introduction to your study. So it was conducted not just here in the Philippines, but 4 other countries, India, Kenya, Nepal, and Uganda. So can you give us the broad strokes?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, JC, there was this enormous learning loss during the pandemic, and there's a lot of doom and gloom about that because it is a big deal. And very costly, but there also is emerging some research, and I've been thrilled to be involved in co-producing this research, some ways to recover that learning loss. So not all hope is lost. There is some bright sparks on things that we can do. So actually in the early part of the pandemic, in late March when the schools were just closing, the first study that we did, and I'll then talk about how we replicated that here in the Philippines, was in Botswana, actually. So in Botswana, schools closed in March, and we were given 3 days before the schools closed to figure out what to do and how to respond while the schools were disrupted. We collected 10,000 phone numbers throughout the country, and we actually didn't know what we were going to do with them. We just knew that it was going to be one of the only ways of reaching people because internet access was very low, radio penetration was uncertain, and so we felt this was going to be the way to stay in touch with kids. And then shortly after, we launched a program which is now called M-Education here in the Philippines, and globally the name of the approach is called Connect Ed, so connecting people with education, wherever they are, however you can reach them. And it was essentially using these phone calls and sending SMS messages and simple 20-minute phone calls. So not a fancy app, nothing fancy actually. We sometimes forget that a phone call is one of the oldest, simplest, most relevant technologies of all. And then a tutor or teacher would call the child and tutor them in basic numeracy. And that was the approach. So 20 minutes once a week per household. We then launched a randomized control trial, which is essentially a rigorous research study. And it was one of the world's first pieces of evidence on distance education in the world. We released the results in July. So only a few months later. Sometimes people think research has to be slow. It doesn't have to be slow. It can be fast and relevant. And we released it in July, and it worked incredibly well, helped the children learn. And then we got interest to try this in many other countries around the world, including here in the Philippines, and I can share more about that effort. But that was the origin story.
How did you decide to include the Philippines in this multi-country study?
Yeah, absolutely. We had interest from lots of countries, dozens and dozens of countries and partners. And one of the things that we realized is that we needed to act quickly. And so we were really looking for partnerships where we could take action fairly quickly. And here in the Philippines, we partnered with IPA, which is another research organization that's been here since 2002 in the Philippines and done research for many years, as well as DepEd. And there was this interest in piloting fairly quickly, actually. And so it started very scrappy, very entrepreneurial. One of our research leads, Jepoy at IPA, actually started trying this approach with his family members and neighbors, just trying to do the phone call and seeing if it could work. And that happened very quickly, and it was working. And then quickly the pilot grew and took a life of its own. And we were really looking for that kind of partnership where there was this desire to take quick action. And then also an organization where there was capacity to do this type of rigorous research because we needed answers. We needed to know what could work. We didn't want to guess. We wanted real evidence and real measurement of learning to see if the children were learning. And we were also really excited by the level of engagement from DepEd, to see that level of government interest in wanting to test the program and wanting to potentially scale the program. And so we had this partnership here in the Philippines. We also had a partnership, as you said, in a few other countries, in Nepal with the World Bank and the government also, and 2 NGOs, in Uganda with an NGO, in Kenya with an NGO, and in India with an NGO. So it was a 5-country study. And so I mentioned that actually the Botswana study was some of the world's first evidence. This 5-country study is actually some of the fastest multi-country evidence ever generated in education on any topic. And I think the pandemic really forced us to rethink how we do research, the speed of it, the scale of it.
And we mentioned that this is a randomized trial. Maybe for the sake of our audience, can you try to briefly explain what a randomized trial is? And we know, of course, that it is the gold standard these days when it comes to looking at what works and what doesn't work when it comes to various development-related policies. So can you explain just a bit what a randomized trial is?
Yeah, absolutely. So randomized trial essentially just randomizes people into a few groups, and the hope there is that they're equal. And so if you randomly get allocated this program or you don't, you should be equal, similar people on average. So it's kind of the closest thing to cloning someone, though we can't clone people, thank goodness. Maybe one day we will be, but a clone, then you could really have a really good comparison group. What happened if you got the intervention, what happened if you didn't, and everything else is the same. So randomization actually does the same thing on average on a population. So it's kind of this amazing technique and approach. And then what happens is, if you just get the intervention and everything else is the same, if you had improved learning at the end of the day, we can be really confident that it was really the intervention and nothing else. So imagine you don't do a randomized trial to kind of show how valuable this can be. Let's say we just ran the intervention with the most motivated schools. And let's say those schools had more learning. We wouldn't know whether it was the program or just the fact that those schools were motivated to begin with, and so they would have done other programming, or they would have had a really motivated principal. And so the randomization helps you address that potential confounder. And that's one example. There's others.
I see. Yes. And can you try to describe, Noam, the interventions specifically that were used? So you mentioned phone calls, but I think you also did SMS or text messages. So how did you decide on these interventions, and what were the effects across all of these 5 countries?
Yeah, so it was a SMS message with basic numeracy content, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, the kind of foundational skills. And we mapped that to the curriculum as well, so that it was aligned with the competencies that are in the national kind of curriculum and frameworks. And then the phone call supplemented that and provided some extra tutoring. And here in the Philippines, we had 2 approaches. So one approach was working with the folks who were on a waiting list to become teachers, but weren't yet hired by the system, by the DepEd system, but they were going to be. And we actually worked with them to become tutors in one group. In another group, we actually worked with government teachers who were already in the system and worked with them to support and call and tutor children. And so that was the approach, 20 minutes once a week for 8 weeks. In total, just 3 hours. That's actually a very light dosage. And the results were extraordinary. So here in the Philippines, we found that the results were 0.45 standard deviations. And I know standard deviations are sort of this very funny metric, but they're a common metric that we use in education research. So just to make clear what that is, actually, the average effectiveness in education is usually 0.1, and half of education interventions don't work at all. So getting anything that's positive is a really big deal. Getting anything that's 0.1 is a big deal. Getting something that's 0.45 is a huge deal. And of all the countries, the Philippines was actually the second most effective of all. And it worked just as well when it was delivered by DepEd government teachers, as well as the folks who were on the waiting list and supported more heavily by an NGO. So that was really striking. So seeing something work is very unusual. Seeing it work with the government is very unusual. So we were really, really excited about it. One more way to put the results in concrete terms is only about 3% of children could divide in grade 3 and 4 in the control group, in those who didn't get the intervention. And those who got the intervention, about 17% to 18% could divide, just after 3 hours. So if you think about that, if you did this approach for just 1 week, all the children would reach division level, which is almost coming back up to grade level. So it gives a little hope. I know we started this with this really shocking statistic of the length of school closure and the amount of learning loss, but the loss can be recovered if we invest in evidence and we do things that are backed by evidence and we scale them for a certain period of time. You can recover most of the learning loss, actually.
Yes, and as we were talking about earlier, we know that the Philippines actually, even before the pandemic, has had a 90% learning poverty rate, where 9 out of 10 children of age 10 aren't able to understand what they're reading, and the results for math are not so good as well. So it's really quite nice to have these studies which show you that actually it's not at all hopeless. And I think it's easy to be hopeless these days, especially given the extent of the education crisis. But here you are with your study, and it gives some hope to policymakers and the Filipino public in general. But Noma, can you describe as well? So I understand that you partnered with DepEd as well as IPA. So some of the interventions were coursed through DepEd and through IPA. Was there any difference between in the delivery of these SMS messages or phone calls between these two arms?
And actually, it's a great point. I didn't actually end up fully answering your SMS question. So we actually also had a treatment arm that was SMS only, without the phone calls. And that doesn't work as well, actually, which would be great. If that worked, it would be really exciting, because it's very cheap and very scalable. But that on its own was hit or miss. So in some countries it worked, in some countries it didn't work. And even when it worked, it wasn't as effective.
But here in the Philippines, it worked as well, as I understand.
It did, actually. So in the Philippines was one of the countries where it did work. It was 0.09 standard deviations, which is pretty good, actually. So that is something to consider. We're still wondering how much to invest in that approach, but we think certainly it's important and has potential. And that, of course, can scale very quickly. And of course, it worked in the Philippines. It didn't work in some other places. Potentially, it worked here because the school closures were so long that anything was really quite valuable, actually, any additional support. And then on the government and IPA-supported treatment groups, or kind of interventions, they were very similar, actually. Similar training, similar support. It was just who was delivering it and the system that they were in, actually. And so sometimes what happens is there's some evidence suggesting that an NGO can deliver an intervention, but when the government does it, it becomes more challenging because the teachers are very busy, there's a lot of constraints in the system. But here we didn't see that. Here we actually saw that it did work when the government delivered it. And I think part of the reason was there were a lot of policies in place that were saying teachers should call students, actually. That was actually something that was in the guidance. And this was just a way of operationalizing that policy. So it actually worked within the system.
And I think interventions like this, SMS messages and phone calls, they're really quite cheap compared to other possible interventions. And it's quite relevant here in the Philippines, where almost everyone actually owns a cell phone. So you can really reach the students, especially in far-flung places.
Yeah, the data is really striking. We had data showing, I think less than 14% of households have broadband internet. It's very, very low access to the internet. I think radio, 30% or less in terms of people who are tuning in. So those were ways that were kind of hard to reach people, even though they're very popular. But as you're saying, mobile phone, over 90%. I think in some cases people might have two phones, actually.
Exactly.
So it really was a way of reaching people. I will say sometimes we had to call the parent or caregiver who would then pass the phone to their child. So it wasn't that the young children all had their own phones. Sometimes it was someone in the household who was giving the phone to the child. And that could be a parent, a cousin, a sibling. We worked with whoever was in the household who was able to provide the phone.
I see. I note, Noam, that in the paper you also looked at the effect of a typhoon here in the Philippines, because around the time you were doing this study, Typhoon Rai or Odette hit the Philippines. And I think that added a certain extra dimension to your analysis. Can you try to describe how that informed your study?
Yeah, it was this, as of course you know, this sudden and quite devastating typhoon, Typhoon Rai. And so there was a question of whether the approach would still work. Would the effects persist? Would we still be able to reach the households? And we could. We reached the households. We were able to do a follow-up survey. And the approach kept working, actually. The effects persisted. So this really opened our eyes. I have to say, as an organization, we had not been thinking as much before the pandemic about school disruptions. It wasn't something that we had invested in. And the pandemic really opened our eyes, and I think it opened the eyes of many people to the fact that disruptions actually happen very commonly. Of course, here there's over 25 typhoons a year, right, that are disrupting school. And in countries around the world, there's weather shocks, conflict, summer breaks, you name it. There's lots of reasons. Earthquakes, schools close for many, many, many reasons. And the amazing thing is we have almost no evidence on how to support education when school is disrupted, but it's maybe when we need to support education the most. And so we've actually started investing, even post-COVID, in how to support education during these disruptions. And so we're working in a few settings where schools are frequently disrupted to try to provide this as an approach to resilience, actually. And I think the word for that is matatag, if I'm not mistaken. So I think this is a really important agenda, actually, is how do we make sure that when there's a disruption or something that is hard to plan for, you can keep going. You can keep the continuity of education. And then also in non-disrupted settings. So there's things about this approach that just make sense. Focusing on foundational skills, reaching people where they are, that can happen during the school year also.
Here in the Philippines, the fact that a lot of typhoons hit the country every year, I've had many vivid memories of doing my homework in the dark with no electricity, no electric fan at all. So I think it's really an important policy question, how to continue children's education even with these constant disruptions. And of course, that the Philippines is not just one of the countries most hit by typhoons, but also most vulnerable to climate change.
Yeah.
So I think the issues will really just worsen in terms of climate change here in the Philippines. So I think this is a very important insight of yours as well.
And you would have wanted to receive a phone call in those moments.
Exactly.
I think that, and I even learned, someone told me actually that here, I think the school calendar was moved because the typhoons were so common. And so they wanted to move the calendar to not be so disrupted, actually. But that reveals how big an issue it is. I think we need a toolkit of evidence-based approaches for these disruptions.
Yes, but funnily enough, actually, if in one of the latest surveys, vast majority of Filipinos want to shift back to the old calendar because we lost the summer months in April and May. Okay. So children now have their summer vacation right at the start of the typhoon season, so they couldn't really enjoy it. So I think that's an interesting aspect to this as well.
Disrupting the joy or disrupting the schooling?
Exactly.
You have to make a trade-off.
Yes, exactly. Economics is all about trade-offs, as we know.
That's true.
So, Noam, actually, I'm also quite curious about how you work with DepEd, how supportive they were, and how receptive they have been when it comes to the results of this study, which actually is quite encouraging. And I'm wondering how they plan to move this forward and what are your future collaborations with them.
The collaboration with DepEd has been quite strong. We have a MOU, IPA has an MOU with DepEd. Though this was actually one of the first randomized studies that have been conducted in education. So it really was breaking some new ground in terms of collaboration on generating evidence. We're hoping that we can continue that in the future. So that was really exciting to work with DepEd and IPA in that new effort to really bring evidence to the agenda on learning loss recovery. And the collaboration has been very strong through the MOU, through joint meetings, at all levels, central, regional, SDO level. There's been really this strong collaboration, and it continues. So we're in current conversations with the DepEd colleagues on what it looks like now that this approach was successful and effective to scale this up in more regions, what it looks like to scale it up in more SDOs, and also how to have a research agenda around this so we keep making it as cost-effective as possible, as cheap as possible, and integrate and embed it in the system.
I see. And actually, even DepEd already has some of its own programs. For example, the National Learning Camps to try to abate the learning losses. And I think even before the pandemic, they had the alternative learning system where there's really a concerted effort on their part to try to reach students who are in far-flung areas or who might not have the typical access to schools. So how do you think your study can inform those types of interventions and programs that they already have? And what are your recommendations to them?
So it is, one of the things that I find is great, actually, is there are, as you're saying, some policies in place and frameworks in place. The National Learning Recovery Program, National Literacy Program, Numeracy Program, some guidance notes and memos that already exist. So I find, and I think we're finding, that these types of approaches really fit into those frameworks. They just provide a concrete option. And so it's not that they're separate, it's not that they're different, they're just concrete. And so often these policies and guidance are high level, and they should be. They should provide a framework and kind of an overarching vision, but what we now need is to operationalize them and make them concrete so that there's something that's being delivered at school level that's very effective. So it's very consistent with those, I would say. Even some of the new curricula changes and integrating with that. So we're trying to align and link in with those frameworks and agendas and provide another concrete option that's really effective.
And when it comes to these SMS messages and phone calls, is there a recommendation to try to scale it up? So basically to try to implement this to as many regions as possible and for longer durations. What are the specific recommendations when it comes to the SMS and phone calls? Or are you looking at possible other technological interventions moving forward?
Yes, so we are hoping to scale it up. And I think the examples you gave of other applications, so it's not just other disruptions, as you said, it might be last mile schools, maybe island schools, maybe just remote schools, but maybe also struggling learners who are behind in kind of even in urban areas. Not all the children can be reached, and we know that there are some kids who are not at grade level, and so how do we help them catch up? So this can be a catch-up approach. There's also a really important principle behind this program, which I'd love to discuss actually, which is targeting instruction. And so often in education, we follow a very, very rigid curriculum. But the child might not always be at grade level. And so you might be teaching a child fractions, but they can't count. And if you just keep doing that, the child's not going to learn actually. And so one of the really key things that there's a lot of evidence on, not just this study, but other evidence on as well, is the importance of assessing the child and seeing what is their real level. Can they add? Can they subtract? Can they multiply? Can they divide? And then teach to their level. So a child who can't add is taught to add. A child who can't subtract is taught to subtract. Now that sounds kind of obvious, but it almost never happens actually. We don't often have frequent assessment. We don't often give room for teachers to target instruction to the child. These phone calls did that actually for two reasons. One, it's actually one-on-one. And so it's almost like tutoring. So you can really make sure you're not just teaching to a whole class. You're actually really focused on that child and their level. So they really learn very quickly. The other thing that we do, and I didn't mention this actually, but we assess the child on the phone. And so you can see, do they know addition? Do they know subtraction? And then you can teach to their level. Again, it sounds kind of obvious. You don't want to teach at the wrong level, but we often do teach at the wrong level, and you want to teach at the right level. So that's a very important principle. Now that principle can also happen in school. It doesn't have to happen over the phone. You can also do assessment in school and teach to the level of the child. You can also do more small groups in the school and teach to the level of the child. So there's this program, but there's also broader principles which could be integrated into the system, which we are excited to try to explore and see if we can work with DepEd on.
Is this the thing they call teaching at the right level from based on previous studies?
Exactly. So that also has lots of randomized trial evidence, has been very effective. Exactly, and that's something that we've been working on in a few countries, as well as the original NGO that developed this, Pratham, JPAL and IPA have done a lot of research on this as well. So exactly, it's a similar principle.
And I think that's quite relevant also to the experience of the Philippines, where unfortunately, for one reason or another, the incentive for every school teacher is to try to promote their students to the next level, even if they haven't mastered yet the foundational skills. I think because of the belief that if there are some students who lag behind, that might be attributed to a failure on their part. So the incentive is to really graduate students or make them graduate as fast as possible. But you're saying that the evidence tells us that maybe we should teach at the right level instead of doing that system.
And it's very common. I mean, it's very common. You have a lot of education systems all over the world. They have these very strict curricula. You promote the children no matter what. That's very common. So it sounds like a very simple idea, but it is quite a change, and it works. So we really need to consider it. Now, some school systems try to do this only for 1 hour a day, because doing it for the entire school day is maybe a lot. But even 1 hour a day can make a world of a difference. In one school term, most of the kids can catch up.
And let's hope that the DepEd and other agencies actually adopt many of these findings from the research. Going back, Noam, to the 5-country study, what were the challenges that you encountered in implementing this during the pandemic? Of course, because of the lockdowns, it was quite difficult, and in the Philippines, the lockdowns were quite strict. So how did you get around all of those problems? And at least now that we don't have the lockdowns anymore, so it's easier to do these things. But what were the challenges that you encountered?
Many challenges. Where to begin?
Yeah.
You can imagine, as you said, doing anything during a lockdown was challenging. Being remote was very challenging. Doing many studies in many countries in 18 months was very challenging. One of the incredible things is we had a network of incredible partners, so that made this possible, and we did most of this virtually, actually. So I think this actually showed us that is possible. It was difficult, but it was possible. Of course, there's nothing that can replace in-person meeting. So actually, this is my first time in the Philippines, and I'm thrilled to be here. And we've been working with the IPA and DepEd team, and finally getting to meet the incredible people who made this study possible. And that's a real treat, and it fills the soul with joy. But we were able to make it happen even remotely. And so it's great to finally be here. It's great to finally meet everyone who made this incredible work possible. But it was possible to do it remotely, and I think that was only the case because we had great partners.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're running out of time, Noam. Maybe as a parting shot for our audience, what's the takeaway for them? So of course, they can read the study that you publish, and we can put a link up to it on the Rappler website or some other platform. But what are the main takeaways for ordinary Filipinos who are invested in seeing a much better education system here in the Philippines? And for policymakers as well, they see now that there are studies like this, but how can they try to integrate that with their work as policymakers?
I would say a few things. So one, I think this work does reveal that evidence can be quite useful. I think sometimes we don't take the time to produce evidence, and then we're not sure what's working and not working. So I think there is a real value to evidence. And I say that as a researcher, who does some research that is not that useful and some research that is useful. I think this is an example where research was quite useful. And the other thing I would say is it can also be fast. And I think as researchers, we need to try to do faster research to address real-time problems, because sometimes we wait 5-10 years to release our results, and here we didn't, and we saw how important that was to be fast. I think what I would say to more practitioners and policy folks, so those were kind of calls to action to researchers, is simplicity is really powerful. This approach was very simple. I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. And we want a fancy gadget or a fancy app, and we want to make it, 100 hours. Oh, sorry, now I'm getting very excited about it. We want it to be 100 hours. This was 3, and it was using a phone. People already had it, and it was meeting where they were and doing something very relatable. And simplicity is really powerful. I think we need to embrace the power of simplicity a little bit more, and familiarity. And the other thing I would say is, as I mentioned at the beginning, that learning loss recovery is possible. I think what we now need to do is we've showed this in a proof of concept, but we haven't scaled it. I think the challenge before us is scaling this, and that will be challenging. Scaling anything is very difficult. So if anyone listening wants to help, be involved, try this, please reach out, because we're going to need all the help that we can get, and we need experts who know the setting, who know how to do this work really well, and people who are eager to make a change. So would be keen to stay in touch as we embark on the next stage of this journey.
Yes, and here's hoping that more governments and education departments all over the world adopt the results of groundbreaking studies such as this one. And it's not easy to do. I mean, you did this across 5 countries. I imagine that's quite a logistical nightmare. But still, you were able to push through with it. So congratulations, Noam, to you and your team.
And as you said, economists think a lot about trade-offs. Sleep was traded off a little bit. We're now recovering some sleep as well as some learning loss.
I see.
But it was worth it. It was worth it.
That's very good.
Yeah.
On that note, thank you so much, Noam, for dropping by here at Rappler, and more power to you and your team. And I hope you can continue to do more groundbreaking research on education and here in the Philippines in particular. And I hope we can collaborate sometime in the future.
Yeah, that would be great. Salamat po. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noam. I'm JC Punongbayan, and thank you for joining us in this episode of Rappler Talk.